Okay, the next set of notes for this unit is about social influence. And social influence is how the actions of others shape the way we think and behave. So, what others are doing, how that changes what we do, and what we think about it. Before we get into this, we need to talk a little bit about some definitions. So, the first thing is our social roles. We've talked about roles before when we talked about Zimbardo and his prison experiment. Roles are those socially defined patterns of behavior that are expected of persons in a given setting or group. Okay, so these roles can be assumed just because of your interests or abilities. Something like you're a pianist or you are a gamer, or they can be imposed on you by the group or by cultural, economic, or biological conditions beyond your control. Things like being a woman or a man, those roles that you assume are given to you without your control. The roles that are imposed on police officers. Um, Social roles prescribe our behavior. They are when we know what you should do, how you should act, and when you should do those things based on your roles. So police officers act in a certain way because of these roles that were set out for them. Social norms are the expectations given to us about what is appropriate and what is acceptable within a group. Um, these can be really, really broad, like your political or religious views, or it can be really specific, like being quiet in the library or walking on the right side of a hallway. But these norms guide everything from the conversation and what we discuss to how we dress in certain situations. And there are those unwritten rules, right? Like the not talking when a teacher is lecturing. Um, those are things that sometimes aren't really ever told to us, but we know that we should follow them, right? They're the norms that are set upon us by a group. So we know that behavior is contagious. Behavior is modeled by one person and then it's followed by another. We follow behavior of others to conform, to shift the way that we are doing to resolve the cognitive dissonance that's happening. And this is called the chameleon effect. Conformity is changing our behavior or our thinking to coincide with a group standard, to kind of go along with what the group is doing, so that we don't have to feel left out. Solomon Asch did a really famous study about this. It's the line study. And what he did is he took participants and he sat them down into a room of 9 other pseudo participants, so Confederates who were in on the study. And what he did is he asked all of them to look at the lines on a piece of paper. And this is how they looked. And he asked, okay, what does this line, which one does it match? A, B, or C? The pseudo participants, the Confederates, all answered incorrectly. Solomon Asch wanted to figure out, would the real participant go along with what the group said, or will they say the correct answer? And what he found was that about a third of trial participants regularly conformed to the unanimous but erroneous or incorrect group answer. And about 75% of all participants conformed at least once throughout the experiment. So what he found is that people do conform when in a group. I did put a link to the video here if you want to watch a little bit more about that study. Okay, so what influences our conformity? Well, the size of the group. The more the people, the more likely one is to conform. This is up to a certain amount, though. The larger the group, okay, so when you're in a group of about 5, 6, 7, you're more likely to go along with the group. However, if that group gets too large, then you start to lose that idea of conformity, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The status of the group makes a difference. So the lower the person's status in the group, the more likely they are to conform. If you feel like you're the low man on the totem pole, you're kind of going to go along with what the other people above you think. The observation of the group. So if you are in private, if the group is in private, or if it is anonymous, you're less likely to conform. If the group is being watched, you are more likely to conform. And then the unanimity, I can't pronounce that word, I'm sorry, of the group. Basically, if everyone agrees, then you're more likely to conform to what everyone else says. So let's look at some examples of these. Well, before we get to the examples, let's talk about why we conform. So there's two reasons why, and we can call them normative social influence and informative. Okay, normative is wanting to avoid rejection or gain social approval. Basically, we want to be accepted by the group. We respect the norms of the group because we want people to like us and we don't want them to ostracize us. Informative social influence is due to the fact that a group may provide valuable information. We want to accept the opinions of others. Basically, we don't know enough, and so we're going to rely on the experts to help us with the decision. So an example of normative social influence would be like you dressing a certain way, playing a game, right? So you're going to follow the way of the dress just so that you're allowed into the golf course. Informative would be money-making decisions or where you're going to go to college. You refer to the experts, right? Because you don't really know, so you're going to ask people who might have a better idea. Okay, next let's talk about compliance. Compliance is adjusting our behavior because someone asked you to. And them asking you can be explicit or implicit, okay? So explicitly is someone just coming out and asking. Implicit is there's an indirect request. So they're kind of assuming that you're going to do this. Indirect requests could include asking for or implying something else. So asking for a sale, or if you would like to go for a ride, a test drive. They might ask you if you need a new car, right? Like they're implying that they want you to buy a new car. That's the idea of compliance. But the difference here, conformity is our perception of the group norm, right? Like we're trying to fit into the group's, our perception of the group. Compliance, someone is coming out and asking you to change, okay? So that's where they are a little bit different. Obedience then is changing our behavior in response to a command of someone in a position of authority. So doing someone because an authority figure asks you to do it. Obeying your parents, obeying a teacher, obeying a police officer. That would be obedience, okay? So conformity is going to be internal pressure to change, right? Like we perceive that we need to change the way that we are acting because we want to fit in with everyone else. Compliance is someone explicitly asking you to change, explicitly asking you or implicitly asking you to change. And then obedience is following the command of an authority figure. Okay? Okay, let's talk about an example of obedience. Milgram's shock experiment. I explained this a little bit in the last video, but let's talk a little bit more explicitly about it. What Stanley Milgram did is he wanted to decide whether or not someone in the position of authority could make people do something terribly wrong. Okay? He was looking at whether someone would go against their morals while they were following an authority figure. And so he took people into a room, and this was the participant here. This was a Confederate. He was the leader of the experiment. And then here was the student, and this was also a Confederate, so they were in on it. This was an actor. This participant was told every time the student got an answer wrong, they were to shock them and increase the level of the shocks one by one every time they got one wrong. The experimenter who was in on the experiment would egg them on, tell them, you need to continue with the experiment, you need to keep going. And he wanted to see if the person would do these really dangerous shocks even when the student was making sounds that made them sound in pain. And he found that 65% of participants obeyed up to the 450 volts, all the way up to the point that they could potentially kill someone from that shock. And they went all the way simply because the guy in a white lab coat told them to. So that authority figure told them. So they obeyed the authority figure. So why? Well, most of the participants rationalized their obedience because they felt the experimenter, the person in the white lab coat, was the one who was responsible and not them. So they're putting it off on someone else, kind of like wiping their hands clean of it. Also, they found that if the authority figure had higher prestige, they were higher up in authority, it was harder to disobey. And if other people were disobeying, they found it was easier for someone to disobey. So they would go against the authority figure. And then the obedience kind of just depended on who the person was, what their morals were. So another idea of social influence are social dilemmas. These are situations where selfish behavior benefits you in the short run. However, it can lead to terrible disasters for an entire group in the long run. These are sometimes called social traps. A really good example of this is us cutting down trees in order to get lumber or paper. We need this paper and this lumber now, but in the long run, this could result in deforestation and possible environmental effects later on, right? So we're willing to just do this selfish behavior now because we get the benefit now. But it could influence us later on. Another or an example of this would be the prisoner's dilemma, and the idea is that two people are separated immediately after being arrested for a serious crime. The DA believes that they are guilty but lacks evidence. Each prisoner has the option of either. So these were the consequences if they either confessed or didn't. So the first is if they refuse to confess, each prisoner will be convicted of a minor offense and jailed for 1 year. If they both confess, the DA will recommend a 5-year sentence for both of them. If one person remains silent and one confesses, the DA will allow the confessing prisoner to go free, whereas the other will serve the maximum 10-year sentence. So what is the best option? Well, the best option is for both of them to come together and refuse to confess, right? But is that going to happen? No, probably not, right? They're going to confess because they're hoping that the other person doesn't and they can go free. So this is one of those dilemmas that we see. We're going to do what's best for us in the long run, but we're really going to kind of put off how it could help other people. Okay, so let's talk about how we behave in the presence of others. The first is social facilitation. This is one of the IA topics, the triplet study. This is the idea that we perform better when there's other people around, okay? Think about you participating in a basketball game. You tend to do really well when people are like cheering you on. When people aren't in the stands, like what happened with the coronavirus, right? You tend to kind of be like, maybe I'm not going to perform so well because there's no one here cheering me on. Usually this occurs with either simple tasks or really well-learned tasks, okay? This does not happen with either difficult or brand new tasks. So this would be something that you're really confident in, like your basketball skills or your knowledge of spelling, something like that.